One phone call, one Saturday, one conversation that arrived just hours before American bombers were expected to hit Iran's energy infrastructure directly. And Iran had already warned exactly what would happen next. Before we walk through exactly what was said on that call and exactly why it mattered enough to change the president's own mind, hit like on this video right now. Subscribe if you want the full, accurate breakdown instead of just the headline. And share this with anyone who thinks phone calls between world leaders are just formalities, because this specific one may have prevented a regional war capable of reshaping global energy markets overnight. Here's the honest, complete account of what actually happened, and it starts with understanding just how close this specific attack genuinely came to launching. President Trump was seriously considering attacking Iranian energy targets within days. That's not speculation. That's the direct assessment from Axios, based on 2 American officials and a third source with direct knowledge of what was actually happening inside the White House. The stated trigger was specific and direct. Iran had launched a missile strike on an American base in Jordan. Iran had also continued disrupting shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, the critical waterway carrying roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil and gas exports. Trump had publicly threatened to hit Iran very hard, just one day before this critical phone call took place. U.S. embassies across the Middle East had already issued security alerts, specifically warning American citizens of what officials called unforeseen escalation. That's the exact atmosphere this phone call dropped into. A president actively weighing a massive strike, embassies warning of imminent danger, and a waterway carrying a fifth of the world's energy supply already effectively closed. Now let's talk about exactly why this particular attack, if it had actually launched, carried stakes considerably larger than anything else in this entire 5-month war. According to a person familiar with the substance of the call, the Saudis were genuinely concerned about one specific scenario. If the United States targeted Iran's energy infrastructure or carried out massive strikes on other key infrastructure, Tehran could respond by attacking the energy infrastructure of Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries directly. Read that specific fear carefully, because it's exactly the scenario capable of turning a bilateral American-Iranian conflict into something considerably larger. Not simply missiles exchanged between 2 countries, but a direct assault on the actual physical infrastructure the entire global economy depends on for its energy supply. Al Jazeera's own reporting confirmed this exact concern directly. The Saudi Crown Prince's intervention centered specifically on worry that a major American strike on Iran's energy infrastructure could trigger Iranian retaliation against Gulf oil and gas facilities. That's not an abstract, theoretical fear either. Saudi Arabia had already faced direct attacks in recent weeks, intercepting drones aimed specifically at its own eastern oil facilities and at Riyadh itself. Iran-aligned Houthi rebels in Yemen had separately struck Saudi crude infrastructure directly and had threatened an entire naval blockade in the Red Sea. So this wasn't Saudi Arabia imagining a hypothetical worst-case scenario. It was Saudi Arabia responding to a threat it had already experienced directly, multiple times, throughout this exact same war. Let's talk about exactly what happened on that specific Saturday call, because the details reveal a genuinely direct, urgent conversation between 2 world leaders. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, described directly by the Associated Press as the kingdom's de facto leader, spoke with Trump by phone. According to a person familiar with the discussion, MBS raised concerns specifically about the United States potentially escalating the conflict with Iran. The Crown Prince did something specific and direct during that call. He sought clarity from Trump on exactly what potential new action the president was actually weighing against Iran. That's a genuinely significant detail. This wasn't simply MBS offering vague general concern. He was actively trying to understand the actual specific scope of what Trump was considering, information Saudi Arabia needed directly in order to prepare for whatever consequences might follow. Saudi Arabia's own state news agency later confirmed the substance of this call publicly. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the agency reported, stressed the necessity of prioritizing dialogue to reduce escalation and the importance of making every possible effort to achieve calm that paves the way for diplomatic solutions. That's the official, on the record, Saudi characterization of exactly what MBS communicated to Trump directly. Not a request, not a demand. A direct, urgent appeal specifically prioritizing dialogue over further military escalation. Now here's where this story becomes genuinely significant, because the timing between this call and Trump's subsequent decision is worth examining directly and honestly. Al Jazeera's own reporting placed these 2 events in explicit, direct sequence. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince spoke to Trump, urging a renewed push for dialogue over further military escalation, hours before the United States president halted his latest attacks on Iran. Hours before. Not days, not weeks. Hours separated this specific phone call from Trump's own subsequent announcement that he was canceling the plan to strike entirely. That timing doesn't automatically prove the phone call alone caused Trump's decision. Multiple other countries were pressing for the exact same outcome at roughly the same moment. But the sequence itself, urgent phone call, followed within hours by a major reversal on the exact issue that call addressed, represents exactly the kind of pattern that makes this specific conversation worth examining in this much detail. It's worth understanding that this wasn't the first time in Trump's own presidency that a phone call with the Saudi crown prince arrived at a genuinely critical moment involving Iran, because this specific pattern has real documented history behind it. Years earlier, during an entirely separate escalation, Trump and MBS spoke by phone the day after Iran had shot down an American military drone, an incident that had prompted genuine fears of a major open military confrontation between Washington and Tehran. In that earlier call, the two leaders discussed Saudi Arabia's own critical role in ensuring regional stability and stability in the global oil market specifically. That earlier call came directly after Trump himself had confirmed canceling a different military attack against Iran, one he described at the time as not being a proportionate response to the drone incident. The parallel between that earlier episode and this current one is genuinely striking. A moment of serious escalation risk, a direct phone call between Trump and the Saudi crown prince, and an ultimate decision to step back from military action. That longer history matters because it reveals this specific relationship, and this specific pattern of urgent, well-timed phone calls during genuine crisis moments isn't a new or isolated phenomenon. It's a recurring feature of how these two leaders have managed moments of acute tension with Iran across multiple separate years and multiple separate crises. Let's talk about the broader diplomatic effort surrounding this specific call, because MBS wasn't operating entirely alone in this specific push for de-escalation. Earlier in that same week, Trump had met directly with Saudi Defense Minister Prince Khalid bin Salman, known widely as KBS, MBS's own brother. That meeting itself reveals something significant, because it was specifically added to the Saudi minister's schedule after an earlier meeting with Vice President J.D. Vance. During that earlier meeting with Vance, according to a source familiar with the matter, KBS told the vice president directly that Saudi Arabia favored de-escalation with Iran. That message came despite, and this detail matters enormously, a joint American-Saudi strike against pro-Iranian militias in Iraq that had occurred that very same week. Think about what that reveals. Saudi Arabia was simultaneously participating in direct military action against Iranian-backed forces in Iraq, while its own defense minister was privately telling American officials the kingdom favored de-escalation with Iran overall. That's not a contradiction so much as a genuinely nuanced position, willing to act firmly against specific, immediate threats to its own territory, while still pushing hard against the kind of massive infrastructure targeting escalation that could spiral considerably further out of control. A source familiar with the matter specifically confirmed these meetings were intended to convey MBS's own views on the broader Iran war and the regional situation overall, delivered through his brother directly to senior American officials, in the days immediately before MBS himself picked up the phone to speak with Trump personally. Let's talk about why Saudi Arabia specifically has the kind of influence capable of actually shifting an American president's own military decisions. Because this wasn't the first time in this exact war that Riyadh's voice carried this much weight. Axios described this dynamic directly and plainly. Despite periods of real tension over the past 5 months, Riyadh has influenced Trump's Iran policy at several critical moments since the war began. That's not a one-time occurrence. It's a documented, recurring pattern throughout this entire conflict. Other regional powers were pressing for the exact same outcome simultaneously, adding real compounding weight to Saudi Arabia's specific intervention. Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and Pakistan were all separately urging the United States and Iran to de-escalate during this exact same window. That's genuinely significant, because it means MBS's phone call wasn't an isolated voice easily dismissed. It represented the most senior, most direct expression of a much broader, coordinated regional diplomatic effort, one involving multiple governments simultaneously pushing in the exact same direction. Iran's own foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, was separately engaged in parallel diplomatic activity during this exact same weekend, speaking directly with Pakistan's own army chief. Qatari mediators, according to reporting on this exact period, were holding their own separate discussions as well, working multiple diplomatic channels simultaneously to try to pull this entire situation back from the edge. It's worth understanding how this specific crisis affected relationships among the Gulf states themselves, because this war has, at certain points, produced a genuinely unusual level of coordination among countries that haven't always aligned easily with each other. At an earlier, particularly dangerous point in this broader conflict, the leaders of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, two countries that had previously been at loggerheads over various regional disputes, spoke directly by phone after missiles struck both of their nations on the very same day. That moment revealed something important about how a shared, direct external threat from Iran had pushed these two governments toward genuine, practical cooperation, despite their own separate history of tension. The Saudi crown prince, during that earlier crisis, had said his country was ready to place all its capabilities at its neighbor's disposal. A striking, direct offer of mutual defense between two nations not always known for that kind of close, immediate coordination. That willingness to set aside previous friction in the face of a shared threat from Iran helps explain why, months later, MBS's own direct intervention with Trump carried the kind of weight and credibility it clearly did. Most Gulf states will not formally side with Israel, since only Bahrain and the UAE maintain full diplomatic ties with Jerusalem. But the broader coalition of Gulf nations has consistently viewed Iran as a genuinely destabilizing force and a real danger to the region, a shared assessment that has repeatedly proven strong enough to override individual disputes between these countries whenever Iran's own actions have threatened multiple nations simultaneously. Now let's talk honestly about why this specific moment carried the genuine risk of an unprecedented regional escalation, language multiple separate sources used directly to describe exactly what was potentially at stake. Axios specifically described the stakes in stark terms. Such an attack, referring to the massive strikes Trump was weighing, could lead to an unprecedented escalation in this 5-month war. That's not casual language. Unprecedented is a specific, deliberate word choice meant to convey that whatever had already happened throughout this entire conflict, this next potential step represented something genuinely, categorically different. This war had already followed a repeating, exhausting pattern by this exact point. It had repeatedly paused as Trump opened the door to negotiations, only to resume again and again when those diplomatic efforts ultimately failed. That specific history matters enormously for understanding why this particular moment felt so genuinely dangerous to the multiple governments actively trying to prevent it. Iran had already threatened directly to retaliate by launching attacks against energy and infrastructure facilities, specifically in Israel and across Gulf countries. That's not a vague, general threat. It's a specific, direct warning about exactly the kind of infrastructure targeting escalation Saudi Arabia was working so urgently to prevent. Let's examine directly what actually happened once Trump made his decision, because the sequence of events immediately following this call reveals exactly how consequential that specific conversation appears to have been. Late that Saturday night, Trump posted directly on Truth Social. "The U.S. is locked and loaded and ready to go against the Islamic Republic of Iran," he wrote, "at levels of military terror, strength, and power not seen since World War II. In that very same post, he announced the cancellation. "We have just been asked by Iran and other Middle Eastern countries to hold off any attack and that the perimeters of a deal has been agreed to," he wrote. He added a specific, direct condition. He had agreed to cancel the attack, he said, subject to being able to rapidly make a deal. Trump claimed the emerging agreement would include what he called the immediate, complete, and total opening of the Strait of Hormuz, along with an end to Iran's nuclear threat. That's the specific public outcome directly following MBS's urgent phone call from earlier that same day. A president who had been seriously weighing a massive attack on Iranian infrastructure, instead announcing its complete cancellation, citing exactly the kind of diplomatic progress Saudi Arabia and the broader coalition of regional mediators had been pushing for throughout that entire week. Let's talk honestly about the specific detail that complicates this entire story, because a genuinely accurate account has to include it directly rather than simply presenting a clean, satisfying resolution. Iran's own response to Trump's announcement wasn't confirmation. It was denial. Iran's semi-official Mehr news agency directly denied that the Islamic Republic had ever asked the United States to refrain from conducting new strikes, calling this specific allegation nothing but a new lie. That denial matters enormously for understanding the full, complete picture here. Trump's own public announcement specifically credited a request from Iran and other Middle Eastern countries. Iran's own state media response suggested that specific characterization, at least regarding Iran's own direct role, simply wasn't accurate. What we can say with genuine confidence, based on multiple separate, independently reported sources, is that Saudi Arabia's specific request was real, was documented, and was confirmed both by American officials speaking anonymously and by Saudi Arabia's own state news agency directly. Whatever role Iran itself did or didn't play in prompting this cancellation, MBS's own intervention is not in serious dispute. Let's step back now and consider what genuinely could have happened if this specific attack had actually proceeded, because understanding the realistic worst-case scenario helps explain why this phone call carries the weight this title's framing suggests. If the United States had struck Iranian energy infrastructure directly, and if Iran had responded, exactly as Saudi Arabia feared, by attacking Gulf energy facilities in return, the consequences would have extended far beyond the Middle East itself. A significant portion of the world's oil and gas supply flows directly through exactly the infrastructure both sides were discussing as potential targets. Disruption on that scale wouldn't have stayed contained to regional markets. Global energy prices, already elevated throughout this entire conflict, could have spiked dramatically and immediately, with consequences reaching households and economies on every continent, regardless of their direct connection to this specific regional dispute. That's precisely the scenario multiple sources described using words like unprecedented escalation, language deliberately chosen to convey something considerably more severe than anything this war had already produced across its first 5 months. Whether that specific scenario would have technically constituted a Third World War in the strictest historical sense is a genuinely fair question to raise directly. But the underlying substance of the fear driving this entire diplomatic push, a regional conflict expanding into a full-scale attack on the global energy infrastructure multiple nations depend on, capable of drawing in additional countries and destabilizing markets worldwide, represents exactly the kind of worst-case scenario the word World War is often used to evoke, even when the formal technical definition might not perfectly apply. Let's talk directly about the specific economic mechanics behind why energy infrastructure attacks carry such uniquely dangerous escalatory potential, because understanding the actual numbers reveals exactly why this specific scenario worried so many governments simultaneously. Oil prices had already surged significantly throughout this broader conflict, with earlier spikes reaching as much as 10% in a single week during periods of heightened tension. That kind of volatility, driven simply by the general risk of ongoing conflict, represents only a fraction of what a direct, confirmed attack on major Gulf energy production facilities could realistically produce. Saudi Arabia and its Gulf neighbors collectively represent an enormous share of the world's total oil production and export capacity. A successful, sustained attack on that infrastructure, rather than simply the threat or the risk of one, would represent a fundamentally different category of economic disruption, potentially removing meaningful global supply from the market entirely, rather than simply elevating prices through uncertainty and risk premiums alone. That's precisely the distinction driving Saudi Arabia's own urgent concern throughout this specific episode. Absorbing the ongoing economic cost of sustained regional tension is one thing, a genuinely difficult but ultimately manageable burden this war had already imposed for months. Absorbing the actual physical destruction of core national energy infrastructure represents an entirely different, considerably more severe category of national and global economic crisis. Let's talk about MBS's own broader, more complicated history throughout this exact war, because it's worth being genuinely honest that his role hasn't been consistently focused on de-escalation alone. Earlier in the same broader conflict, according to reporting from the Washington Post, Mohammed bin Salman had actually argued in favor of an attack on Iran during multiple separate phone calls with Trump. That's a genuinely important, complicating detail worth including directly, rather than presenting MBS purely as a consistent peacemaker throughout this entire war. At an earlier, different point in this conflict, the Saudi Crown Prince had said his country was ready to place all its capabilities at a neighbor's disposal, shortly before attacks on Saudi soil were subsequently confirmed. That reveals a leader whose specific position on escalation versus de-escalation has genuinely shifted at different points throughout this war, based on the specific circumstances and specific threats Saudi Arabia itself was actually facing at each particular moment. That complexity matters, because it means this specific phone call shouldn't be understood as evidence of some fixed, unchanging Saudi position favoring peace above all else. It should be understood as a specific, calculated intervention made at this exact moment, because this exact potential escalation direct strikes on energy infrastructure with the realistic risk of retaliation against Saudi Arabia's own facilities represented a threat MBS judged serious enough to require direct, urgent personal engagement with the American president. Let's bring this all together into the honest, complete picture this specific moment actually represents. Trump was seriously weighing a massive strike against Iranian energy infrastructure, a decision multiple sources described as carrying the genuine risk of unprecedented regional escalation. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman called Trump directly on a Saturday, urgently pressing for renewed dialogue over further military escalation, specifically citing fear that Iran would retaliate against Gulf energy infrastructure if that strike proceeded. Hours later, Trump announced he was canceling the planned attack, citing progress toward a deal, though Iran's own state media directly denied having requested that specific outcome. Multiple other regional powers, Qatar, the UAE, Turkey, and Pakistan, were simultaneously pressing for the exact same de-escalation, meaning MBS's specific intervention represented the most senior, most direct expression of a considerably broader, coordinated diplomatic effort. That's the honest, complete story underneath this title's dramatic framing. Not a single phone call acting entirely alone to prevent global catastrophe, but a genuinely significant, well-documented intervention from one of America's most influential regional partners, arriving at precisely the moment it mattered most, as part of a broader, urgent diplomatic effort specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of infrastructure targeting escalation capable of destabilizing global energy markets and potentially drawing multiple additional nations directly into open conflict. There's a final, important dimension worth understanding about why this specific call carried the weight it clearly did, one connected directly to the unique position Saudi Arabia occupies in Washington's broader strategic thinking. Saudi Arabia isn't simply one voice among many regional powers commenting on this conflict from the outside. It represents one of America's most economically and strategically important partnerships in the entire region, a relationship built on decades of interconnected oil markets, defense cooperation, and direct personal ties between successive American administrations and the Saudi royal family itself. When a leader with that level of established direct access picks up the phone specifically to express urgent concern, that call carries a fundamentally different weight than a similar message delivered through more conventional diplomatic channels. That specific access, built over years of direct personal relationship between Trump and MBS specifically, is precisely why this phone call could function the way it apparently did, cutting directly through to the president himself on a Saturday with enough immediate credibility to factor directly into a major military decision within the very same day. Consider for a moment what genuinely was and wasn't prevented here, because an honest accounting requires real precision rather than simple, satisfying certainty in either direction. We cannot know with complete confidence exactly what would have happened if this specific strike had actually proceeded. Iran might have retaliated exactly as Saudi Arabia feared, or the strike might have proceeded without triggering the broader regional escalation everyone was genuinely worried about. What we can say with real confidence is this: multiple senior officials across multiple governments genuinely, urgently believed that outcome was possible, enough to warrant this level of direct, immediate diplomatic intervention. That genuine, documented fear, not simply hypothetical worst-case thinking, but active concern serious enough to trigger urgent phone calls between heads of state, is itself the real story here, regardless of exactly how catastrophic the actual counterfactual outcome would ultimately have proven to be. Consider, too, what this specific moment actually means for the people whose lives sit most directly inside its consequences. Families across the Gulf region living in the shadow of energy infrastructure that both American planners and Saudi officials openly discussed as a potential target in an escalating war. Ordinary consumers across the entire globe, whose household energy costs remained directly tied to whether this specific waterway and this specific regional infrastructure continued functioning without the kind of catastrophic disruption this particular phone call may have helped prevent. And diplomats and officials across multiple countries working urgently over a single fraught weekend to pull an already exhausting, already 5-month-long war back from what multiple sources genuinely described as its most dangerous threshold yet. So here's the question worth carrying forward as this story continues developing in the days ahead. When a single phone call, confirmed by Saudi Arabia's own state news agency and corroborated by multiple independent American sources, arrives just hours before a major escalation that officials genuinely feared could trigger unprecedented regional conflict, how much weight should we actually place on the role of personal direct diplomacy in a war this volatile and this repeatedly close to spiraling further out of control? And more importantly, with Iran's own state media denying it ever requested this specific cancellation, and with this entire war having already paused and resumed multiple times throughout its 5-month history, how confident should anyone genuinely be that this particular pause, however consequential the phone call behind it may have been, actually holds any longer than the ones that came before it?